Welcome to another episode of One on One with Dr. Bajaj. Now that's me, and today I want to talk to you about time-restricted eating. So we've addressed caloric restriction in a previous video. We've addressed dietary restriction in a previous video as well. Now essentially what this is limiting the feeding window to a certain time block and basically not eating outside of the block. Very commonly and very popular is the 16-8 method. Essentially, you eat for an 8-hour time window and you do not consume any food or calories for 16 hours outside of that. Now, practically speaking, this form of intermittent fasting has been instructed to most people as skipping breakfast. So you stop eating around 7 p.m. or so and really go through till about 11 a.m. the next day, essentially creating a 16-hour fasting window and then by default creating an 8-hour feeding window. But we're going to talk more about how this came to be, where did this number come from, and is it actually realistic? Is it actually applicable? And is there actually any proven benefit?
Unlocking the secrets of longevity, wellness, and peak performance. Dive deep into the world of cutting-edge health, explore groundbreaking medical advances, and uncover the keys to living your best life at any age. This is One on One with Dr. Bajaj, where science meets life and vitality knows no limits.
Time-restricted eating, there's really three types. There's number one, which is like the feeding window, the short-term window that I just mentioned. Number two is every other day eating or every other day fasting, which we'll talk about. And finally, number three is hypocaloric fasting or eating, essentially just eating enough to survive. I'm going to break these three types of time-restricted eating down today. We'll look into some of the research as well. As we get into this, of course, there are some benefits associated with this type of fasting and this type of caloric intake. The 5 major benefits include, number one, you deplete your liver from fat stores. So if you're not eating, your liver begins to release its fat stores into the bloodstream to get broken down to become energy, essentially. That's great because you're basically exhausting the fat storage from your liver, and a less fatty liver is a healthier liver. Number two, after about 2 to 3 days of fasting, you go into something called starvation ketosis. Now, starvation ketosis essentially is basically breaking down your body fat stores and then releasing that as energy. So you're breaking down the fat that you've already stored, and that now becomes an energy source in your bloodstream. This is another way to basically decrease your fat percentage body composition and hopefully maintaining the other more important structures like protein and muscle, etc. The other benefit of fasting like this, maybe a multiple day fast, is you have decreased insulin release. Now, insulin typically gets released when you have caloric intake and you're taking in sugar, which then causes insulin to get released. But if you're not taking in calories or sugar, obviously, or glucose, then there's no reason for that insulin to escalate or be released. And then if insulin is not being released, you're not getting some of the negative metabolic consequences of a chronically high insulin level. This is where a lot of things like diabetes and metabolic disease and many metabolic disorders are born. So if we can regulate this system, it's incredibly powerful. Number 4, the mTOR pathway. Now, the mTOR pathway is basically a enzymatic reaction that occurs in our body, and it's been associated with increased or accelerated aging. So if you're not increasing your mTOR pathway activity, you're potentially decreasing aging. And mTOR goes up with feeding or eating. So therefore, if you're not eating and you're more of in a fasting or starvation state, your mTOR pathway activity decreases, which potentially can slow down the aging process. And finally, number 5, autophagy. Now, autophagy basically is when your body undergoes a chemical kind of recycling or a chemical housekeeping process in your body. So if you're not eating for a while, after a couple of days, your body switches into this recycle housekeeping mode where it begins to break down damaged cells, diseased cells, has a better job locating senescent cells or zombie cells as well, which are basically just kind of non-functional cells that could potentially become very damaging or very metabolically destructive if they're not handled. So huge potential benefit as you break into autophagy, kind of maintain your body's excellent and optimized state. Huge benefits, no question about it. But let's dive deeper into the 3 types of fasting, starting with the short window fasting, which is like the 16-8 or commonly or popularly called intermittent fasting. Now, if we take 16-8 and look further into that, where did this come from? Where did we get 16 hours off and 8 hours on? Where did this even come from? Well, so I was curious about that and I looked deeper into it. Here's what I discovered. This came from a study done in mice, okay? And the mice basically were they were compared an experimental group utilizing the 16-8 feeding window versus a control group, which basically ate whenever they wanted, both having equal caloric intake, demonstrated that the 16-8 experimental group actually gained less weight. Okay, so that was the conclusion of the study. A couple of problems with this. So that was basically then taken and extrapolated directly to humans. So 16-8 in mice demonstrated decreased weight gain compared to a control group. Therefore, 16-8 in human should equate to the same thing. That's literally what was done. A couple problems with this. Number one, the life expectancy of a mouse or mice is like 2 to 3 years. So obviously much less than human beings, where our average life expectancy is in the mid 70s currently. So that means if you're to equate a 16-8 feeding window from a mouse that lives 2 to 3 years in a human, you're actually looking at a multiple day fast to really compare apples to apples. Very, very important point. And like I said earlier, some of the greatest benefits of fasting actually show up after 2 to 3 days of fasting, not after 16 hours. Moreover, there's tons of research out there demonstrating that a 16-8 fasting window or 16-8 kind of intermittent feeding schedule doesn't really demonstrate much benefit at all. As a matter of fact, in 2020, so very recent, a study was concluded by a gentleman named Ethan Weiss. 116 volunteers were taken in. They were placed on the 16-8 intermittent fasting schedule, and the conclusion was no change in cardiac benefit and no change in weight. And you may think, well, this is a fluke. Maybe the study was just a one-off, whatever. This was actually replicated in a couple of other studies very, very recently, 2020, just a few years behind us. So clearly demonstrating maybe there's not as much benefit there as we think. However, that being said, there is a study out there demonstrating the feeding window is actually important. So like I said earlier in this video, or in this conversation, popularly, we're told a 16-8 fasting plan, the best way to do that is to skip breakfast, right? Because it seems easy for us, whatever. However, if you break down the data and you look at the research, we tend to do better with any sort of potential benefit if you're going to do 16-8 with an early fasting window, meaning instead of skipping breakfast, you skip dinner. If you skip dinner, then it kind of shift your window to the morning, you're actually looking at a potentially superior result with weight loss and overall metabolic health if you're going to stick to something like the 16-8 window. And specifically what was demonstrated in this study was decreased glucose levels and decreased insulin levels compared to control subjects over a 24-hour period, which kind of makes sense, right? Because you're taking in less calories near the end of the day, your body has a chance to kind of catch up and then hopefully begin some of these positive effects associated with fasting. Two other major problems when it comes to fasting in general, guys. Number one, decreased protein intake. Sure, you're not taking in calories, which is fantastic, but you're also not taking in protein. And if you're not taking in protein, the fundamental building block of our bodies, you're going to basically break down your protein in your body to kind of maintain and manage those levels. And if that happens, you can literally lose muscle mass. And if you begin to lose muscle mass, obviously that has a significant number of negative effects down the road. That's a conversation for another video, which will be coming up soon. So not only are you not taking in fat and carbohydrates, which is potentially great, if you're not taking in protein, you run a very high likelihood of breaking down your body's own protein stores. I'm going to kind of loop back to this and tell you another big problem with this in a moment. But finally, number three, one of the other major problems is once you break that fast, once that clock strikes and the alarm goes off and your fast is over, people tend to overconsume and indulge significantly because we have this artificial or perhaps inaccurate idea that we haven't eaten for 16 hours. So therefore, whatever we eat is fine because we're not going to gain weight and we're going to be healthy because we haven't eaten anything. So we're going to go just destroy a bunch of carbohydrates. This is much more common than you think. I certainly am guilty of this, just like most of my clients are. But this is a major problem, overindulgence and being somewhat blinded to the types of calories you're taking in. And most of the time, what ends up happening when people do kind of submit to this overconsumption is an increase in calories coming from fat and carbohydrates and a decrease in calories coming from protein, ultimately leading to a body composition that is very unfavorable, specifically increased fat and decreased muscle. Exactly the opposite of what most of us want, and certainly the opposite of any sort of longevity protocol. Now, remember, I said I wanted to talk more about the protein intake. So don't forget, guys, in the big picture of your body, time is undefeated. We're all getting older. It's a known fact that our lean muscle mass goes down. No matter what you do, no matter how healthy you are, your lean muscle mass will decrease over time. So if you're not consuming enough protein just to maintain those levels as we age, you're certainly going to lose muscle mass. Now, if you're fasting in an unhealthy fashion, you're not only going to continue to lose protein, but you're going to accelerate that process from the baseline loss that you're going to experience anyway. So it's potentially very dangerous, and just keep in mind it accelerates protein and muscle loss, lean body mass loss in our system that's already headed towards decreased lean body mass unless you choose to fight it. Now, the second type of fasting is called alternative day fasting. Now, alternative day fasting is basically you eat normal one day, the next day you eat little to nothing, and you just keep going back and forth. Although this isn't very popular, and thankfully for good cause, because if you look deeper into the studies on this, the data demonstrates that on the fasting days, the days when you're not necessarily eating, these patients notice a decrease in physical activity and a decrease in overall feelings of well-being, essentially kind of leading to the conclusion that the days you're fasting, you just feel really bad. You just don't feel good physically or mentally, and you don't really end up doing anything. So the bigger question is this really something that we should think about if every other day we basically feel like poop physically and mentally, and then the days that we're eating normal, we just kind of feel normal, right? Moreover, combined with the fact that there is not a lot of data out there up alternative day fasting as really providing any sort of successful measurements. Doesn't necessarily help with lean body mass, doesn't necessarily help with cardiac health, doesn't necessarily help with maintaining weight loss. So it's really not something to consider. Maybe in extreme cases of metabolic disease. Outside of that, there's really no indication. And then the third and final is hypocaloric fasting. This is basically just taking in enough calories that you need to survive. Typically about anywhere from 700 calories to maybe about 800 calories, depending on who you are. Sometimes as low as 500 calories in some of us that are maybe more petite, etc. So this is basically just like barely scraping by metabolically and survival wise, right? You're basically telling your body we're in full survival mode at all times. You can imagine the negative consequences of effects. You can imagine the negative consequences associated with a diet of this nature. As a matter of fact, there really isn't much data showing this to be beneficial in any way, shape, or form. And the only time to really consider this is somebody who is an extreme metabolic disease, extreme emergency treatment needed, somebody who's just massively obese, maybe their levels are just through the roof, their glucose, their insulin, everything is just shot, hormones are in the toilet. Maybe in a patient like this, you consider temporarily using hypocaloric fasting methods as a rescue intervention until you can implement greater and more important and more effective techniques. So guys, to sum up this episode, time-restricted eating, really the 5 big benefits include decreased fat from your liver. Number 2, starvation ketosis, which decreases to not only less fat overall in your body, but you begin to use those ketones to provide energy for your brain, for your body. Secondary benefit I didn't mention earlier, ketones typically decrease hunger hormones. So interestingly, you actually don't feel hungry after 2 to 3 days of not eating. Number 3, you decrease the mTOR pathway, thereby potentially decrease the process of aging. Number 4, you decrease insulin levels because you're not eating, you're not taking in glucose, thereby you're not escalating or spiking your insulin. That's definitely a good thing. And finally, number 5, autophagy. Autophagy is basically your body's own cellular housekeeping and cellular recycling program, right? Very, very important for all of us to do that. Huge benefits. Reconsider the 16-8. If, as we talked about earlier, that's probably not the best way to go. Most of the research states you need more than that. You probably need more like 20 off and 4 on, or even multi-day fasts. Obviously, there's some associated dangers if you don't do this right. So don't wing it. Definitely get in touch with a physician who you feel comfortable with, who can confidently shepherd you through a program like this, so you can really maximize any sort of benefits. Well, guys, I hope this was helpful for you. This is part 3 of our 3-part series. Today, we talked about time-restricted eating. Previously, we talked about caloric restriction and dietary restriction in previous videos. And remember, the best time to start something was yesterday. The second best time is today. Don't look back tomorrow with regret. Take one small step today to get yourself maximally optimized. Thank you for tuning into this episode of One-on-One with me, Dr. Bajaj. If you find any value in these episodes and any value in the show, please like and subscribe and share these episodes, specifically the ones you feel may help some of your friends and family.